Chapter 28. Brief, I pray you, for you see 'tis a busy time with me. From Much Ado About Nothing. The tribe, or rather half tribe, of Delawares, which has been so often mentioned, and whose present place of encampment was so nigh the temporary village of the Hurons, could assemble about an equal number of warriors with the latter people. Like their neighbors, they had followed Montcalm into the territories of the English crown, and were making heavy and serious inroads on the hunting grounds of the Mohawks, though they had seen fit, with the mysterious reserve so common among the natives, to withhold their assistance at the moment when it was most required. The French had accounted for this unexpected defection on the part of their ally in various ways. It was the prevalent opinion, however, that they had been influenced by the veneration for the ancient treaty that had once made them dependent on the Six Nations for military protection, and now rendered them reluctant to encounter their former masters. As for the tribe itself, it had been content to announce to Montcalm, through his emissaries, with Indian brevity, that their hatchets were dull, and time was necessary to sharpen them. The politic captain of the Canadas had deemed it wiser to submit to entertain a passive friend, than by acts of ill-judged severity to convert him into an open enemy. On that morning, when Magua led his silent party from the settlement of the Beavers into the forest, in the manner described, the sun rose upon the Delaware encampment, as if it had suddenly burst upon a busy people, actively employed in all the customary avocations of high noon. The women ran from lodge to lodge, some engaged in preparing their morning's meal, a few earnestly bent on seeking the comforts necessary to their habits, but more pausing to exchange hasty and whispered sentences with their friends. The warriors were lounging in groups, musing more than they conversed, and then a few words were uttered, speaking like men who deeply weighed their opinions. The instruments of the chase were to be seen in abundance among the lodges, but none departed. Here and there a warrior was examining his arms, with an attention that is rarely bestowed on the implements, when no other enemy than the beast of the forest is expected to be encountered; and occasionally the eyes of a whole group were turned simultaneously toward a large and silent lodge in the center of the village, as if it contained the subject of their common thoughts. During the existence of this scene, a man suddenly appeared at the furthest extremity of a platform of rock which formed the level of the village. He was without arms, and his paint tended rather to soften than increase the natural sternness of his austere countenance. When in full view of the Delawares, he stopped, and made a gesture of amity, by throwing his arm upward toward heaven, and then letting it fall impressively on his breast. The inhabitants of the village answered his salute by a low murmur of welcome, and encouraged him to advance by similar indications of friendship. Fortified by these assurances, the dark figure left the brow of the rocky terrace, where it had stood for a moment, drawn in a strong outline against the blushing morning sky, and moved with dignity into the very center of the huts. As he approached, nothing was audible but the rattling of the light silver ornaments that loaded his arms and neck, and the tinkling of the little bells that fringed his deerskin moccasins. He made, as he advanced, many courteous signs of greeting to the men he passed, neglecting to notice the woman, however, like one who deemed their favor in the present enterprise of no importance. When he had reached the group in which it was evident by the haughtiness of their common mien that the principal chiefs were collected, the stranger paused, and then the Delawares saw that the active and erect form that stood before them was that of the well-known Huron chief, Le Renard Subtil. His reception was grave, silent, and wary. The warriors in front stepped aside, opening the way to their most approved orator by the action, one who spoke all those languages that were cultivated among the northern aborigines. "The wise Huron is welcome," said the Delaware, in the language of the Maquas. "He is come to eat his succotash with his brothers of the lakes." Footnote: A dish composed of cracked corn and beans. It is much used also by the whites, but corn is meant maize. End footnote. "He is come," repeated Maqua, bending his head with the dignity of an Eastern prince. The chief extended his arm, and taking the other by the wrist, they once more exchanged friendly salutations. Then the Delaware invited his guest to enter his own lodge and share his morning meal. The invitation was accepted, and the two warriors, attended by 3 or 4 of the old men, walked calmly away, leaving the rest of the tribe devoured by a desire to understand the reasons of so unusual a visit, and yet not betraying the least impatience by sign or word. During the short and frugal repast that followed, the conversation was extremely circumspect, and related entirely to the events of the hunt in which Maqua had so lately been engaged. It would have been impossible for the most finished breeding to wear more of the appearance of considering the visit as a thing of course than did his host, notwithstanding every individual present was perfectly aware that it must be connected with some secret object, and that probably of importance to themselves. When the appetites of the whole were appeased, the squaws removed the trenchers and gourds, and the two parties began to prepare themselves for a subtle trial of their wits. "Is the face of my great Canada father turned again toward his Huron children?" demanded the orator of the Delawares. "When was it ever otherwise?" returned Maqua. "He calls my people most beloved." The Delaware graciously bowed his acquiescence to what he knew to be false, and continued: "The tomahawks of your young men have been very red." "It is so, but they are now bright and dull, for the Yengeese are dead, and the Delawares are our neighbors." The other acknowledged the pacific compliment by a gesture of the hand, and remained silent. Then Maqua, as if recalled to such a recollection by the allusion to the massacre, demanded: "Does my prisoner give trouble to my brothers?" "She is welcome." "The path between the Hurons and the Delawares is short, and it is open. Let her be sent to my squaws if she gives trouble to my brother." "She is welcome," returned the chief of the latter nation, still more emphatically. The baffled Maqua continued silent several minutes, apparently indifferent, however, to the repulse he had received in his opening effort to regain possession of Cora. "Do my young men leave the Delawares' room on the mountains for their hunts?" he at length continued. "The Lenapes are rulers of their own hills," returned the other a little haughtily. "It is well. Justice is the master of a red skin. Why should they brighten their tomahawks and sharpen their knives against each other? Are not the pale faces thicker than the swallows in the season of the flowers?" "Good!" exclaimed 2 or 3 of his auditors at the same time. Maqua waited a little to permit his words to soften the feelings of the Delawares before he added: "Have there not been strange moccasins in the woods? Have not my brothers scented the feet of white men?" "Let my Canada father come," returned the other evasively. "His children are ready to see him." "When the great chief comes, it is to smoke with the Indians in their wigwams. The Hurons say, too, he is welcome; but the Yengeese have long arms, and legs that never tire. My young men dreamed that they had seen the trail of the Yengeese nigh the village of the Delawares." "They will not find the Lenape asleep." "It is well. The warrior whose eye is open can see his enemy," said Maqua. once more shifting his ground, when he found himself unable to penetrate the caution of his companion.
"I have brought gifts to my brother. His nation would not go on the war path because they did not think it well, but their friends have remembered where they lived."
When he had thus announced his liberal intention, the crafty chief arose, and gravely spread his presents before the dazzled eyes of his host. They consisted principally of trinkets of little value, plundered from the slaughtered females of William Henry. In the division of the baubles the cunning Huron discovered no less art than in their selection. While he bestowed those of greater value on the two most distinguished warriors, one of whom was his host, he seasoned his offerings to their inferiors with such well timed and apposite compliments as left them no ground of complaint. In short, the whole ceremony contained such a happy blending of the profitable with the flattering, that it was not difficult for the donor immediately to read the effect of a generosity so aptly mingled with praise in the eyes of those he addressed. This well judged and politic stroke on the part of Maqua was not without instantaneous results. The Delawares lost their gravity in a much more cordial expression, and the host, in particular, after contemplating his own liberal share of the spoil for some moments with peculiar gratification, repeated with strong emphasis the words,
"My brother is a wise chief. He is welcome." "The Hurons love their friends the Delawares," returned Maqua. "Why should they not? They are colored by the same sun, and their just men will hunt in the same grounds after death. The redskins should be friends, and look with open eyes on the white men. Has not my brother scented spies in the woods?"
The Delaware, whose name in English signified hard heart, an appellation that the French had translated in le coeur dur, forgot that obduracy of purpose which had probably obtained him so significant a title. His countenance grew very sensibly less stern, and he now deigned to answer more directly.
"There have been strange moccasins about my camp. They have been tracked into my lodges." "Did my brother beat out the dogs?"
asked Maqua, without adverting in any manner to the former equivocation of the chief.
"It would not do. The stranger is always welcome to the children of the Lenape." "The stranger, but not the spy." "Would the Yengeese send their women as spies? Did not the Huron chief say he took women in the battle?" "He told no lie. The Yengeese have sent out their scouts. They have been in my wigwams, but they found there no one to say welcome. Then they fled to the Delawares, for, say they, the Delawares are our friends. Their minds are turned from their Canada father."
The insinuation was a home thrust, and one that in a more advanced state of society would have entitled Maqua to the reputation of a skillful diplomatist. The recent defection of the tribe had, as they well knew themselves, subjected the Delawares to much reproach among their French allies, and they were now made to feel that their future actions were to be regarded with jealousy and distrust. There was no deep insight into causes and effects necessary to foresee that such a situation of things was likely to prove highly prejudicial to their future movements. Their distant villages, their hunting grounds, and hundreds of their women and children, together with a material part of their physical force, were actually within the limits of the French territory. Accordingly, this alarming annunciation was received, as Maqua intended, with manifest disapprobation, if not with alarm.
"Let my father look in my face," said Le Coeur dur. "He will see no change. It is true, my young men did not go out on the war path. They had dreams for not doing so, but they love and venerate the great white chief." "Will he think so when he hears that his greatest enemy is fed in the camp of his children? When he is told a bloody Yankee smokes at your fire, And the pale face, who has slain so many of his friends, goes in and out among the Delawares? Go! My great Canada father is not a fool." "Where is the Yengeese that the Delawares fear?" returned the other, "who has slain my young men? Who is the mortal enemy of my great father?" "Le Long Carabine."
The Delaware warriors started at the well known name, betraying by their amazement that they had now learned for the first time one so famous among the Indian allies of France was within their power.
"What does my brother mean?"
demanded Le Cordeur, in a tone that by its wonder far exceeded the usual apathy of his race.
"A Huron never lies,"
returned Magua coldly, leaning his head against the side of the lodge, and drawing his slight robe across his tawny breast.
"Let the Delawares count their prisoners. They will find one whose skin is neither red nor pale."
A long and musing pause succeeded. The chief consulted apart with his companions, and messengers dispatched to collect certain others of the most distinguished men of the tribe. As warrior after warrior dropped in, they were each made acquainted in turn with the important intelligence that Magua had just communicated. The air of surprise and the usual low, deep, guttural exclamation were common to them all. The news spread from mouth to mouth, until the whole encampment became powerfully agitated. The women suspended their labors to catch such syllables as unguardedly fell from the lips of the consulting warriors. The boys deserted their sports, and, walking fearlessly among their fathers, looked up in curious admiration as they heard the brief exclamations of wonder they so freely expressed the temerity of their hated foe. In short, every occupation was abandoned for the time, and all other pursuits seemed discarded in order that the tribe might freely indulge, after their own peculiar manner, in an open expression of feeling. When the excitement had a little abated, the old men disposed themselves seriously to consider that which became the honor and safety of their tribe to perform under circumstances of so much delicacy and embarrassment. During all these movements, and in the midst of the general commotion, Magua had not only maintained his seat, but the very attitude he had originally taken against the side of the lodge, where he continued as immovable, and apparently as unconcerned as if he had no interest in the result. Not a single indication of the future intentions of his host, however, escaped his vigilant eyes. With his consummate knowledge of the nature of the people with whom he had to deal, he anticipated every measure on which they decided, and it might almost be said that in many instances he knew their intentions even before they became known to themselves. The council of the Delawares was short. When it was ended, a general bustle announced that it was to be immediately succeeded by a solemn and formal assemblage of the nation. As such meetings are rare, and only called on occasions of the last importance, the subtle Huron, who still sat apart, a wily and dark observer of the proceedings, now knew that all his projects must be brought to their final issue. He therefore left the lodge, and walked silently forth to the place in front of the encampment, whither the warriors were already beginning to collect. It might have been half an hour before each individual, including even the women and children, was in his place. The delay had been created by the grave preparations that were deemed necessary to so solemn and unusual a conference. But when the sun was seen climbing above the tops of that mountain, against whose bosom the Delawares had constructed their encampment, most were seated, and his bright rays darted from behind the outline of trees that fringed the eminence. They fell upon as grave and as attentive, and as deeply interested a multitude as was probably ever before lighted by his morning beams. Its number somewhat exceeded 1,000 souls. In a collection of so serious savages, there is never to be found any impatient aspirant after premature distinction, standing ready to move his auditors to some hasty and perhaps injudicious discussion, in order that his own reputation might be the gainer. An act of so much precipitancy and presumption would seal the downfall of precocious intellect forever. It rested solely on the oldest and most experienced of the men to lay the subject of the conference before the people. Until such a one arose to make some movement, no deeds in arms, no natural gifts, nor any renown as an orator would have justified the slightest interruption. On the present occasion, the aged warrior whose privilege it was to speak was silent, seemingly oppressed with the magnitude of his subject. The delay had already continued long beyond the usual deliberative pause that always preceded a conference, but no sign of impatience or surprise escaped even the youngest boy. Occasionally an eye was raised from the earth, where the looks of most were riveted, and strayed toward a particular lodge, that was, however, in no manner distinguished from those around it, except in the peculiar care that had been taken to protect it against the assaults of the weather. At length, one of those low murmurs that are so apt to disturb a multitude was heard, and the whole nation arose to their feet by a common impulse. At that instant the door of the lodge in question opened, and three men issuing from it slowly approached the place of consultation. They were all aged, even beyond that period to which the oldest present had reached, but one in the centre, who leaned on his companions for support, had numbered an amount of years to which the human race is seldom permitted to attain. His frame, which had once been tall and erect like the cedar, was now bending under the pressure of more than a century. The elastic, light step of an Indian was gone, and in its place he was compelled to toil his tardy way over the ground, inch by inch. His dark, wrinkled countenance was in singular and wild contrast to the long white locks which floated on his shoulders, in such thickness as to announce that generations had probably passed away since they had last been shorn. The dress of this patriarch, for such, considering his vast age, in conjunction with his affinity and influence with his people, he might very properly be termed, was rich and imposing, though strictly after the simple fashions of the tribe. His robe was of the finest skins, which had been deprived of their fur in order to admit of a hieroglyphical representation of various deeds in arms done in former ages. His bosom was loaded with medals, some in massive silver, and one or two even in gold, the gifts of various Christian potentates during the long period of his life. He also wore armlets and cinctures above the ankles, and the latter precious metal. His head, on the whole of which the hair had been permitted to grow, the pursuits of war having so long been abandoned, was encircled by a sort of plaited diadem, which in turn bore lesser and more glittering ornaments, that sparkled amid the glossy hues of three drooping ostrich feathers, dyed a deep black in touching contrast to the color of his snow-white locks. His tomahawk was nearly hid in silver, and the handle of his knife shone like a horn of solid gold. So soon as the first hum of emotion and pleasure, which the sudden appearance of this venerated individual created, had a little subsided, the name of Tamenund was whispered from mouth to mouth. Magua had often heard the fame of this wise and just Delaware, a reputation that even proceeded so far as to bestow on him the rare gift of holding secret communion with the Great Spirit, and which has since transmitted his name, with some slight alteration, to the white usurpers of his ancient territory, as the imaginary tutelar saint of a vast empire. Footnote: The Americans sometimes called their tutelar saint Talmane, a corruption of the name of the renowned chief here introduced. There are many traditions which speak of the character and power of Tamenund. End footnote. The Huron chief, therefore, stepped eagerly out a little from the throng, to a spot whence he might catch a nearer glimpse of the features of the man whose decision was likely to produce so deep an influence on his own fortunes. The eyes of the old man were closed, as though the organs were wearied with having so long witnessed the selfish workings of human passions. The color of his skin differed from that of most around him, being richer and darker, the latter having been produced by certain delicate and mazy lines of complicated and yet beautiful figures, which had been traced over most of his person by the operation of tattooing. Notwithstanding the position of the Huron, he passed the observant and silent Maqua without notice, and, leaning on his two venerable supporters, proceeded to the high place of the multitude, where he seated himself in the center of his nation, with the dignity of a monarch and the air of a father. Nothing could surpass the reverence and affection with which this unexpected visit from one who belongs rather to another world than to this was received by his people. After a suitable and decent pause, the principal chiefs arose, and, approaching the patriarch, they placed his hands reverently on their heads, seeming to entreat a blessing. The younger men were content with touching his robe, or even drawing nigh his person, in order to breathe in the atmosphere of one so aged, so just, and so valiant. None but the most distinguished among the youthful warriors even presumed so far as to perform the latter ceremony, the great mass of the multitude deeming it a sufficient happiness to look upon a form so deeply venerated and so well beloved. When these acts of affection and respect were performed, the chiefs drew back again to their several places, and silence reigned in the whole encampment. After a short delay, a few of the young men, to whom instructions had been whispered by one of the aged attendants at Tamenund, arose, left the crowd, and entered the lodge which has already been noted as the object of so much attention throughout that morning. In a few minutes they reappeared, escorting the individuals who had caused all these solemn preparations toward the seat of judgment. The crowd opened in a lane, and when the party had re-entered, it closed in again, forming a large and dense belt of human bodies, arranged in an open circle. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29. Quote, the assembly seated, rising o'er the rest, Achilles thus the king of men addressed. Unquote, from Pope's Iliad. Cora stood foremost among the prisoners, entwining her arms in those of Alice in the tenderness of sisterly love. Notwithstanding the fearful and menacing array of savages on every side of her, no apprehension on her own account could prevent the nobler minded maiden from keeping her eyes fastened on the pale and anxious features of the trembling Alice. Close at their side stood Heyward, with an interest in both, that, at such a moment of intense uncertainty, scarcely knew a preponderance in favor of her whom he most loved. Hawkeye had placed himself a little in the rear, with a deference to the superior rank of his companions, that no similarity in the state of their present fortunes could induce him to forget. Uncas was not there. When perfect silence was again restored, and after the usual long, impressive pause, one of the two aged chiefs who sat at the side of the patriarch arose and demanded aloud, in very intelligible English,
Which of my prisoners is Le Long Carabine?
Neither Duncan nor the scout answered. The former, however, glanced his eyes around the dark and silent assembly, and recoiled a pace when they fell on the malignant visage of Magua. He saw at once that this wily savage had some secret agency in their present arraignment before the nation, and determined to throw every possible impediment in the way of execution of his sinister plans. He had witnessed one instance of the summary punishments of the Indians, and now dreaded that his companion was to be selected for a second. In this dilemma, with little or no time for reflection, he suddenly determined to cloak his invaluable friend at every hazard to himself. Before he had time, however, to speak, the question was repeated in a louder voice and with a clearer utterance.
"Give us arms," the young man haughtily replied, "and place us in yonder woods. Our deeds shall speak for us." "This is the warrior whose name has filled our ears,"
returned the chief, regarding Heyward with that sort of curious interest which seems inseparable from man when first beholding one of his fellows to whom merit or accident, virtue or crime, has given notoriety.
"What has brought the white man into the camp of the Delawares?" "My necessities. I come for food, shelter, and friends." "It cannot be. The woods are full of game. The head of a warrior needs no other shelter than a sky without clouds, and the Delawares are the enemies and not the friends of the Yankees. Go, the mouth has spoken while the heart said nothing."
Duncan, a little at a loss in whatever manner to proceed, remained silent; but the scout, who had listened attentively to all that passed, now advanced steadily to the front. That I did not answer to the call for la longue carabine was not owning either to shame or fear, he said, for neither one nor the other is the gift of an honest man. But I do not admit to the right of the Mingoes to bestow a name on one whose friends have been mindful of his gifts, in this particular, especially as their title is a lie, killdeer being a grooved barrel and no carabine. I am the man, however, that got the name of Nathaniel from my kin, the compliment of Hawkeye from the Delawares, who live on their own river, and whom the Iroquois have presumed to style the Long Rifle, without any warranty from him who is most concerned in the matter. The eyes of all present, which had hitherto been gravely scanning the person of Duncan, were now turned on the instant toward the upright iron frame of this new pretender to the distinguished appellation. It was in no degree remarkable that there should be found two who were willing to claim so great an honor, for impostors, though rare, were not unknown among the natives; but it was altogether material to the just and severe intentions of the Delaware that there should be no mistake in the matter. Some of their old men consulted together in private, and then, as it would seem, they determined to interrogate their visitor on the subject.
"My brother has said that a snake crept into my camp," said the chief to Makwa. "Which is he?"
The Huron pointed to the scout.
"Will a wise Delaware believe the barking of a wolf?"
exclaimed Duncan, still more confirmed in the evil intentions of his ancient enemy.
"A dog never lies; but when was a wolf known to speak the truth?"
The eyes of Makwa flashed fire, but suddenly recollecting the necessity of maintaining his presence of mind, he turned away in silent disdain, well assured that the sagacity of the Indians would not fail to extract the real merits of the point in controversy. He was not deceived, for after another short consultation, the wary Delaware turned to him again, and expressed the determination of the chiefs, though in the most considerate language.
"My brother has been called a liar," he said, "and his friends are angry. They will show that he has spoken the truth. Give my prisoners guns, and let them prove which is the man."
Makwa affected to consider the expedient, which he well knew proceeded from distrust of himself, as a compliment, and made a gesture of acquiescence, well content that his veracity should be supported by so skillful a marksman as the scout. The weapons were instantly placed in the hands of the friendly opponents, and they were bid to fire over the heads of the seated multitude at an earthen vessel which lay, by accident, on a stump, some 50 yards from the place where they stood. Heyward smiled to himself at the idea of a competition with the scout, though he determined to persevere in the deception until apprised of the real designs of Magua. Raising his rifle with the utmost care, and renewing his aim 3 several times, he fired. The bullet cut the wood within a few inches of the vessel, and a general exclamation of satisfaction announced that the shot was considered a proof of great skill in the use of a weapon. Even Hawkeye nodded his head, as if he would say, it was better than he expected; but instead of manifesting an intention to contend with the successful marksman, he stood leaning on his rifle for more than a minute, like a man who was completely buried in thought. From his reverie he was, however, awakened by one of the young Indians who had furnished the arms, and who now touched his shoulder, saying, in exceedingly broken English,
Can the pale face beat it?
"Yes, Huron," exclaimed the scout, raising the short rifle in his right hand, and shaking it at Magua, with as much apparent ease as if it were a reed. "Yes, Huron, I could strike you now, and no power on earth could prevent the deed. The soaring hawk is no more certain of the dove than I am this moment of you. Did I choose to send a bullet to your heart, why should I not? Why? Because the gifts of my color forbid it, and I might draw down evil on tender and innocent heads. If you know such a being as God, thank him, therefore, in your inward soul, for you have reason." The flushed countenance, angry eye, and swelling figure of the scout produced a sensation of secret awe in all that heard him. The Delawares held their breath in expectation; but Magua himself, even while he distrusted the forbearance of his enemy, remained immovable and calm, where he stood wedged in by the crowd, as one who grew to the spot.
Beat it!
repeated the young Delaware at the elbow of the scout. "Beat what, fool, what?" exclaimed Hawkeye, still flourishing the weapon angrily above his head, though his eye no longer sought the person of Magua.
"If the white man is the warrior he pretends,"
said the aged chief,
"let him strike nigher to the mark."
The scout laughed aloud, a noise that produced the startling effect of an unnatural sound on Heyward. Then, dropping the piece heavily into the extended left hand, it was discharged, apparently by the shock, driving the fragments of the vessel into the air, and scattering them on every side. Almost at the same instant the rattling sound of the rifle was heard, as he suffered it to fall contemptuously to the earth. The first impression of so strange a scene was engrossing admiration. Then a low but increasing murmur ran through the multitude, and finally swelled into sounds that denoted a lively opposition in the sentiments of the spectators, while some openly testified their satisfaction at so unexampled dexterity. By far the larger portion of the tribe were inclined to believe the success of the shot was the result of accident. Heyward was not slow to confirm an opinion that was so favorable to his own pretensions.
"It was chance," he exclaimed. "None can shoot without an aim."
"Chance!" echoed the excited woodsman, who was now stubbornly bent on maintaining his identity at every hazard, and on whom the secret hints of Heyward to acquiesce in the deception were entirely lost. "Does yonder lying Huron, too, think it chance? Give him another gun, and place us face to face, without cover or dodge, and let Providence and our own eyes decide the matter atween us. I do not make the offer to you, Major, for our blood is of a color, and we serve the same master."
"That the Huron is a liar is very evident,"
returned Heyward coolly.
"You have yourself heard him assert you to be La Longue Carabine."
It were impossible to say what violent assertion the stubborn Hawkeye would have next made, in his headlong wish to vindicate his identity, had not the aged Delaware once more interposed.
"The hawk which comes from the clouds can return when he will," he said. "Give them the guns."
This time the scout seized the rifle with avidity; nor had Mahquah, though he watched the movements of the marksman with jealous eyes, any further cause for apprehension. "Now let it be proved in the face of this tribe of Delawares which is the better man," cried the scout, tapping the butt of his piece with that finger which had pulled so many fatal triggers. "You see that gourd hanging against yonder tree, Major? If you are a marksman fit for the borders, let me see you break its shell." Duncan noted the object, and prepared himself to renew the trial. The gourd was one of the usual little vessels used by the Indians, and it was suspended from a dead branch of a small pine by a thong of deerskin, at the full distance of 100 yards. So strangely compounded is the feeling of self-love, that the young soldier, while he knew the utter worthlessness of the suffrages of his savage umpires, forgot the sudden motives of the contest in which to excel. It had been seen already that his skill was far from being contemptible, and he now resolved to put forth its nicest qualities. Had his life depended on the issue, the aim of Duncan could not have been more deliberate or guarded. He fired, and 3 or 4 young Indians, who sprang forward at the report, announced with a shout that the ball was in the tree, a very little on one side of the proper object. The warriors uttered a common ejaculation of pleasure, and then turned their eyes inquiringly on the movements of his rival. "It may do for the Royal Americans," said Hawkeye, laughing once more in his own silent, heartfelt manner; "but had my gun often turned so much from the true line, many a marten, whose skin is now in a lady's muff, would still be in the woods; ay, and many a bloody Mingo, who is departed to his final account, would be acting his deviltries at this very day atween the provinces. I hope the squaw who owns the gourd has more of them in her wigwam, for this will never hold water again." The scout had shook his priming and cocked his piece, while speaking, and as he ended, he threw back a foot and slowly raised the muzzle from the earth. The motion was steady, uniform, and in one direction. When on a perfect level, it remained for a single moment without tremor or variation, as though both man and the rifle were carved in stone. During that stationed instant it poured forth its contents in a bright, glancing sheet of flame. Again the young Indians bounded forward, but their hurried search and disappointed looks announced that no traces of the bullet were to be seen. "Go!" said the old chief to the scout, in a tone of strong distrust. "Thou art a wolf in the skin of a dog. I will talk to the long rifle of the Yengeese." "Ah, had I that piece which furnished the name you use, I would obligate myself to cut the thong and drop the gourd without breaking it," returned Hawkeye, perfectly undisturbed by the other's manner. "Fools! If you would find the bullet of a sharpshooter in these woods, you must look in the object, and not around it." The Indian youths instantly comprehended his meaning, for this time he spoke in the Delaware tongue, and tearing the gourd from the tree, they held it on high with an exulting shout, displaying a hole in its bottom, which had been cut by the bullet after passing through the usual orifice in the centre of its upper side. At this unexpected exhibition a loud and vehement expression of pleasure burst from the mouth of every warrior present. It decided the question, and effectually established Hawkeye in the possession of his dangerous reputation. Those curious and admiring eyes, which had been turned again on Heyward, were finally directed to the weather beaten form of the scout, who immediately became the principal object of attention to the simple and unsophisticated beings by whom he was surrounded. When the sudden and noisy commotion had a little subsided, the aged chief resumed his examination.
"Why did you wish to stop my ears?" he said, addressing Duncan. "Are the Delawares fools that they could not know the young panther from the cat?"
"They will yet find the Huron a singing bird," said Duncan, endeavoring to adopt the figurative language of the natives.
"It is good. We will know who can shut the ears of men, brother,"
added the chief, turning his eyes on Maqua.
"The Delawares, listen."
Thus singled and directly called on to declare his object, the Huron arose, and advancing with great deliberation and dignity into the very center of the circle, where he stood confronted by the prisoners, he placed himself in an attitude to speak. Before opening his mouth, however, he bent his eyes slowly among the whole living boundary of earnest faces, as if to temper his expressions to the capabilities of his audience. On Hawkeye he cast a glance of respectful enmity; on Duncan a look of inextinguishable hatred. The shrinking figure of Alice he scarcely deigned to notice; but when his glance met the firm, commanding, and yet lovely form of Cora, his eye lingered a moment with an expression that might have been difficult to define. Then, filled with his own dark detentions, he spoke in the language of the Canadas, a tongue that he knew well was comprehended by most of his auditors.
"The spirit that made men colored them differently," commenced the subtle Huron. "Some are blacker than the sluggish bear. These, he said, should be slaves, and he ordered them to work forever, like the beaver. You may hear them groan when the south wind blows, louder than the lowing buffaloes along the shores of the great lake, where the big canoes come and go with them in droves. Some he made with faces paler than the ermine of the forest, and these he ordered to be traders, dogs to their women, and wolves to their slaves. He gave this people the nature of the pigeon, wings that never tire, young more plentiful than the leaves of the trees, and appetites to devour the earth. He gave them tongues like the false call of the wildcat, hearts like rabbits, the cunning of the hog, but none of the fox, and arms longer than the legs of the moose. With his tongue he stops the ears of the Indians. His heart teaches him to pay warriors to fight his battles. His cunning tells him how to get together the goods of the earth, and his arms enclose the land from the shores of the salt water to the islands of the great lake. His gluttony makes him sick. God gave him enough, and yet he wants all. Such are the pale faces. Some the Great Spirit made with skins brighter and redder than yonder sun," continued Maqua, pointing impressively upward to the lurid luminary, which was struggling through the misty atmosphere of the horizon; "and these did he fashion to his own mind. He gave them his island as he had made it, covered with trees and filled with game. The wind made their clearings, the sun and rain ripened their fruits, and the snows came to tell them to be thankful. What need had they of roads to journey by? They saw through the hills. When the beavers worked, they lay in shade and looked on. The winds cooled them in summer; in winter, skins kept them warm. If they fought among themselves, it was to prove that they were men. They were brave, they were just, they were happy."
Here the speaker paused, and again looked around him to discover if his legend had touched the sympathy of his listeners. He met everywhere with eyes riveted on his own, heads erect, and nostrils expanded, as if each individual present felt himself able and willing singly to redress the wrongs of his race.
"If the Great Spirit gave different tongues to his red children," he continued, in a low, still melancholy voice, It was that all animals might understand them. Some he placed among the snows with their cousin the bear. Some he placed near the setting sun, on the road to the happy hunting grounds. Some on the lands around the great fresh waters. But to his greatest and most beloved he gave the sands of the salt lake. Do my brothers know the name of this favored people? It was the Lenape!
exclaimed 20 eager voices in a breath.
It was the Lenape,
returned Maqua, affecting to bend his head in reverence to their former greatness.
It was the tribes of the Lenape. The sun rose from water that was salt, and set in water that was sweet, and never hid himself from their eyes. But why should I, a Huron of the woods, tell a wise people their own traditions? Why remind them of their injuries, their ancient greatness, their deeds, their glory, their happiness, their losses, their defeats, their misery? Is there not one among them who has seen it all, and knows it to be true? I have done. My tongue is still, for my heart is of lead. I listen.
As the voice of the speaker suddenly ceased, every face and all eyes turned by a common movement toward the venerable Tamenund. From the moment that he took his seat until the present instant, the lips of the patriarch had not severed, and scarcely a sign of life had escaped him. He sat bent in feebleness, and apparently unconscious of the presence he was in, during the whole of that opening scene, in which the skill of the scout had been so clearly established. At the nicely graduated sound of Maqua's voice, however, he betrayed some evidence of consciousness, and once or twice he even raised his head, as if to listen. But when the crafty Huron spoke of his nation by name, the eyelids of the old man raised themselves, and he looked out upon the multitude with that sort of dull, unmeaning expression which might be supposed to belong to the countenance of a spectre. Then he made an effort to rise, and being upheld by his supporters, he gained his feet in a posture commanding by its dignity, while he tottered with weakness.
Who call upon the children of the Lenape?
He said, in a deep, guttural voice, that was rendered awfully audible by the breathless silence of the multitude.
Who speaks of things gone? Does not the egg become a worm, the worm a fly, and perish? Why tell the Delawares of good that is past? Better thank the Manitou for that which remains. It is a Wyandot,
said Maqua, stepping nigher to the rude platform on which the others stood.
A friend of Tamenund. A friend?
repeated the sage, on whose brow a dark frown settled, imparting a portion of that severity which had rendered his eye so terrible in middle age.
Are the Mingoes rulers of the earth? What brings a Huron here? Justice. His prisoners are with his brothers, and he comes for his own.
Tamenund turned his head toward one of his supporters, and listened to the short explanation the man gave. Then, facing the applicant, he regarded him for a moment with deep attention, after which he said, in a low and reluctant voice:
Justice is the law of the great Manitou. My children, give the stranger food. Then, Huron, take thine own and depart.
On the delivery of this solemn judgment, the patriarch seated himself and closed his eyes again, as if better pleased with the images of his own ripened experience than with the visible objects of the world. Against such a decree there was no Delaware sufficiently hardy to murmur, much less oppose himself. The words were barely uttered when 4 or 5 of the younger warriors, stepping behind Heyward and the scout, passed thongs so dexterously and rapidly around their arms
as to hold them both in instant bondage. The former was too much engrossed with his precious and nearly insensible burden to be aware of their intentions before they were executed; and the latter, who considered even the hostile tribes of the Delaware a superior race of beings, submitted without resistance. Perhaps, however, the manner of the scout would not have been so passive, had he fully comprehended the language in which the preceding dialogue had been conducted. Machua cast a look of triumph around the whole assembly before he proceeded to the execution of his purpose. Perceiving that the men were unable to offer any resistance, he turned his look on her he valued most. Cora met his gaze with an eye so calm and firm that his resolution wavered. Then, recollecting his former artifice, he raised Alice from the arms of the warrior against whom she leaned, and, beckoning Heyward to follow, he motioned for the encircling crowd to open. But Cora, instead of obeying the impulse he had expected, rushed to the feet of the patriarch, and, raising her voice, exclaimed out loud: "Just and venerable Delaware, on thy wisdom and power we lean for mercy. Be deaf to yonder artful and remorseless monster, who poisons thy ears with falsehoods to feed his thirst for blood. Thou that hast lived long, and that hast seen the evil of the world, should know how to temper its calamities to the miserable." The eyes of the old man opened heavily, and he once more looked upward at the multitude. As the piercing tones of the suppliant swelled on his ears, they moved slowly in the direction of her person, and finally settled there on a steady gaze. Cora had cast herself to her knees, and, with hands clenched in each other and pressed upon her bosom, she remained like a beauteous and breathing model of her sex, looking up in his faded but majestic countenance with a species of holy reverence. Gradually the expression of Tamenund's features changed, and, losing their vacancy in admiration, they lighted with a portion of that intelligence which a century before had been wont to communicate his youthful fire to the extensive bands of the Delawares. Rising without assistance, and seemingly without an effort, he demanded in a voice that startled its auditors by its firmness:
"What art thou?"
"A woman, one of a hated race, if thou wilt, a Yankee, but one who has never harmed thee, and who cannot harm thy people if she would, who hast forsook her."
"Tell me, my children,"
continued the patriarch hoarsely, motioning to those around him, though his eyes still dwelt upon the kneeling form of Cora,
"where have the Delawares camped?"
"In the mountains of the Iroquois, beyond the clear springs of the Horican."
"Many parching summers are come and gone,"
continued the sage,
"since I drank the water of my own rivers.
"The children of Miquon are the justest white men, but they are thirsty, and took it to themselves."
Do they follow us so far?"
Footnote: William Penn was termed Miquon by the Delawares, and, as he never used violence or injustice in his dealings with them, his reputation for probity passed into a proverb. The American is justly proud of the origin of his nation, which is perhaps unequaled in the history of the world; but the Pennsylvanian and Jerseyman have more reason to value themselves in their ancestors than the natives of any other state, since no wrong was done the original owners of the soil. "We follow none, we covet nothing," answered Cora. "Captives against our wills, we have been brought amongst you, and we ask but permission to be part to our own in peace. Art thou not Tamenund, the father, the judge, I had almost said the prophet of his people?"
"I am Tamenund of many days."
"'Tis now some 7 years that one of thy people was at the mercy of a white chief on the borders of this province. He claimed to be of the blood of the good and just Tamenund. 'Go,' said the white man, 'for thy parents' sake thou art free.' Dost thou remember the name of that English warrior?"
"I remember that when a laughing boy,"
returned the patriarch, with the peculiar recollection of vast age,
"I stood upon the sands of the seashore, and saw a big canoe, with wings whiter than the swans, and wider than many eagles, come from the rising sun."
"Nay, nay, I speak not of a time so very distant, but of favor shown to thy kindred by one of mine, within the memory of thy youngest warrior."
"Was it when the Yankees and the Dutchmen fought for the hunting grounds of the Delawares? Then Tamenund was chief, and first laid aside the bow for the lightning of the pale faces."
"Not yet then," interrupted Cora. "By many ages. I speak of a thing of yesterday. Surely, surely you forgot it not."
"It was but yesterday,"
rejoined the aged man, with touching pathos,
"that the children of the Lenape were masters of the world. The fishes of the salt lake, the birds, the beasts, and the mengi of the woods owned them for sagamores."
Cora bowed her head in disappointment, and for a bitter moment struggled with her chagrin. Then, elevating her rich features and beaming eyes, she continued, in tones scarcely less penetrating than the unearthly voice of the patriarch himself: "Tell me, is Tamenund a father?" The old man looked down upon her from his elevated stand, with a benignant smile on his wasted countenance, and then, casting his eyes slowly over the whole assemblage, he answered:
"Of a nation."
"For myself I ask nothing. Like thee and thine, venerable chief," she continued, pressing her hands convulsively on her heart, and suffering her head to droop until her burning cheeks were nearly concealed in the maze of dark, glossy tresses that fell in disorder on her shoulders, "the curse of my ancestors has fallen heavily on their child; but yonder is one who has never known the weight of Heaven's displeasure until now. She is the daughter of an old and failing man, whose days are near their close. She has many, very many, to love her and delight in her, and she is too good, much too precious, to become the victim of that villain."
"I know that the pale faces are a proud and hungry race. I know that they claim not only to have the earth, but that the meanest of their color is better than the sachems of the red man. The dogs and crows of their tribes,"
continued the earnest old chieftain, without heeding the wounded spirit of his listener, whose head was nearly crushed to the earth in shame as he proceeded,
"would bark and caw before they would take a woman to their wigwams, whose blood was not the color of snow. But let them not boast before the face of the Manitou too loud. They entered the land of the rising, and may yet go off at the setting sun. I have often seen the locust strip the leaves from the trees, but the season of blossoms has always come again."
"It is so," said Cora, drawing a long breath, as if reviving from a trance, raising her face, and shaking back her shining veil with a kindling eye that contradicted the deathlike paleness of her countenance. "But why is it not permitted us to inquire? There is yet one of thine own people who has not been brought before thee, before thou lettest the Huron depart in triumph. Hear him speak." Observing Tamenund to look about him doubtfully, one of his companions said:
"It is a snake, a redskin in the pay of the Yankees. We keep him for the torture." "Let him come," returned the sage.
Then Tamenund once more sank into his seat, and a silence so deep prevailed while the young man prepared to obey his simple mandate, that the leaves, which fluttered in the draught of the light morning air, were distinctly heard rustling in the surrounding forest. Chapter 29.